What is going on, everyone? Today is June 4th, 2024. You were tuned in to the Invest in Hockey podcast. My name's Anthony Santini, joined here with,
Eric Wilson.
and today we are on episode 28, lucky number 28, my jersey. Oh, sorry, my hockey jersey number, actually. So, shout out to me. Obviously, tough game last night. We lost 8-4 in beer league. Nothing worse than showing up to a game at 11:15 and then putting on an absolute stinker. Starting with myself, that was brutal performance, but it's all good. We're focused on the Stanley Cup final right now. That's exactly what you want to look at. But I know before we get started, you wanted to shout out a particular individual that just had a big accomplishment just last week.
Yeah, so shout out goes out to Nic Sima, current OHL player, just won the Memorial Cup with the Saginaw Spirit. He actually wears number 92, which is my favorite number. I know you just talked about 28 there, Sans, but he can add that to his resume um, as he's got a big career ahead. We're invested. We have a big video slash podcast that we did with him. If you guys want to check that out, it's our most popular YouTube video actually. Um, the views have been good, the comments have been good, so super excited for Nick and what's to come. And yeah, without further ado, Sans, Stanley Cup Finals.
Yeah, shout out to Nick, obviously, friend of the program, came on the podcast a couple months ago. Shout out to him. He's a beauty. Went to high school with him. Absolutely great guy. Hopefully, this achievement can help burst his um journey to the NHL, hopefully. But looking at the NHL right now, I mean, I know we want to keep focus on the Stanley Cup final. There's a lot going on outside buzz, and that just happens every time. It is June. And it feels weird still watching hockey because it's been like what 8, 9 months of hockey it feels like, or maybe not, but that's exactly what it feels like considering how much we've watched recently, how much it's been since like early October, and still the NHL is going on, and it looks like the 2024 Stanley Cup Final will be the Florida Panthers playing against the Edmonton Oilers. And I mean, you can look at this matchup from any scope, from any means necessary. Like, this is what I believe a legacy series for McDavid and something that can change what, he's made of. Because if you can get the Stanley Cup early on in your series, I think that it would make the next 5 years of his career, sorry, early on in his career. If you can get that Stanley Cup early on in your career, it kind of takes that load off your back because we've seen for many years Ovechkin dealt with it where, people said, yeah, but he doesn't have a cup. And so many other players have dealt with the same issue where they say, yeah, but he doesn't have a cup. We've seen it with Lundqvist, obviously retired. Joe Pavelski actually too, which I don't think Pavelski won a cup either, right? And I believe it looks like he will be retiring. So
Yeah.
this is a big series for McDavid. That's what I think.
Yeah, that's like the biggest kind of highlight of the series before you go into it. And whether you are an Oilers fan, maybe you're not an Oilers fan, maybe you like the Flames or the Leafs, and you kind of you've always played the Oilers in the regular season and never really played them in the playoffs. But at the end of the day, both of these teams come from such a different place, and I'm like so excited to see what they kind of have in stock for the Stanley Cup Finals. Like honestly, you look at before the playoffs, you can see how both teams would make it far, but seeing this actual matchup is weird to me, and it's almost like an exciting weird. So, how do you kind of feel about it when you look back at like the first round and stuff, Sans?
I mean, I don't think I would have anticipated the Oilers to even be in this position. Looking back from the first round, looking back to a month ago, looking back to weeks ago, looking back all the way to November where they started what 5-12-1. And then obviously, coaches fired, changes are made, and out of nowhere the Oilers are back, I guess. But it doesn't matter anymore. Oilers are in the Stanley Cup final, massive for McDavid. And I feel like it should have been Dallas and the Rangers. That's exactly what I bet on. I had a bet on them, so I'm a little bit disappointed in that aspect. But I don't know. I just feel like those are the two best teams in these playoffs. And obviously, I stand corrected seeing that it is the Oilers and the Panthers. But for me personally, I feel like that the Panthers are just going to trample over the Oilers. And, could that stem from starting with Bobrovsky in net against Stuart Skinner? I feel like that's a big one. Could it start with the defensive firepower that the Panthers have in comparison to the Oilers? I think so, yes. The only thing that the Oilers really have over the Panthers that I'd be worried about is that power play. And I mean, obviously, that high end talent that just absolutely exceeds anything that Florida has to offer.
Yes, I mean, really well said. The number one thing I'll say is you were really accountable with yourself there, and how, at the end of the day we didn't have these predictions. Yeah, it's the two best teams in hockey right now because they're in the finals, but even looking back at my predictions, I didn't have Dallas New York, but I had Dallas Carolina, and although those guys aren't in the finals, it's the hardest trophy in sports to win, and I think like any hockey fan can say that with passion and pride, just because it's been already such a long playoffs, and now you got to wait till Saturday for game one, right? Like it's a process for both these teams. The one thing to kind of build off your point about the power play there, like yeah, you know what the Oilers power play is capable of, but I don't think people are aware of what the Panthers power play is capable of. And I truly think the Panthers power play has a lot of potential in this series for many reasons, which I will get into. But what do you kind of think about what that power play can do?
I mean, I think it starts with Barkov, right? Like he's one of the most underrated players, and we've seen that this year. We saw it last year, and we're going to continue to see it for many years. Obviously, won the Selkie this year. I believe that came out right. He won the
Yeah,
Selkie this year,
yeah.
and he'll be in contention for the rest of his career for an
Over your
award
boy.
like that, right? Huh?
Over your boy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, anyways, whatever. Matthews should have won it, could have won it, but it doesn't matter. That's not the trophy we're after. Barkov is definitely after the right trophy right now. And then Matthews could go out and figure it out maybe another year down the road, whatever. But yeah, I just think that the way that Florida has been able to connect has allowed them to play better. And I was listening to 32 Thoughts, the podcast, and they actually talked about how the Panthers are so similar to, you know, the Bruins when the Bruins won the Stanley Cup. And when you look at what they had to offer, not that high end talent like the Oilers provide, but just, four lines that could really go, a third line that could be a first line on a contending team. Like we saw that with Dallas, where whole all 12 forwards were just amazing. We saw that third line, it was made up of like Jamie Benn, Pavelski, and Sagan, I believe. It was all over the place. They were switching things up. You throw them out the third line, and they were just off as offensively talented as almost
Yeah.
any first line in the league. So we're seeing that with Florida, where you can almost put up any line, and they're going to put out not only a good fight, but one of the best in the league.
Yeah, yeah. Putting up a fight, I think um looking at the end of this episode, we are going to release how many games we think it's going to go to. I know you kind of did say your prediction already. I'll let the viewers rewind if they need to. I'll wait till the end to kind of give my full prediction, but nothing beats a 7 game series, which we were able to see a couple times during these playoffs. But one thing that a buddy of ours said to me today, George Gibbons, our buddy from Ottawa, he said there were not too many series that started out 2-0 in these playoffs, and I kind of like took me a second to realize like he was pretty right. Like a lot of the series that these guys were involved in were 1-1 to start it off, meaning the road team stole a game, and then after that it kind of was, all hell would break loose. But 1-1 to start a series is kind of seemed to be, you know open doors for either team, and it seems like the whole home ice advantage thing doesn't really kick in until I want to call it game four. I don't know. What are your thoughts on the whole home ice thing?
I mean, if you could pick up two games at home, that's definitely going to set the tone. And I believe the Oilers have home ice advantage. Or no, is it Florida that has home ice
Oh,
advantage this
yeah.
series? So starting off with the Oilers, coming into game one, you're already at a slight disadvantage considering how well Florida has played at home this year. And obviously the Oilers have been just as good on the road. However, when it's the Stanley Cup final, it's a whole different animal. And we've just seen what NHL playoffs have looked like when your team's at home. I mean, it's ridiculous. Look at what Edmonton provided in what was that game six? That crowd was just insane. So I feel like that's going to be one of the biggest factors when it comes to the Stanley Cup final this year. And I feel like, it could go the distance. Not saying it's my prediction, but I could see where this series goes wire to wire.
Yeah. I mean, the biggest, like I said at the start of this episode, the number one guy in talks is Connor McDavid. Realistically, number two has to be Barkov in the series, and like that might discredit Leon Draisaitl a little, but Barkov's been around for a kind of a similar time as Draisaitl. I want to say he's maybe a year younger or a year older. I'm sure you agree, Sans. Like they're around that similar age where they've been in the league for maybe 10 years. Um, I do think Barkov has a lot more to offer being the big guy on the team. I think because Draisaitl's overshadowed by McDavid, that he's not going to get the credit. He's not going to get the certain opportunities that McDavid will have playing against the top line, right? And I think um, what I'm trying to say here is you're going to see a lot of Alexander Barkov and Connor McDavid taking draws against each other, um, out against each other 5-on-5. I don't see it being any other way, and I think that Barkov has that edge. Call it defensively, call it draws, which I hate to say it, he's a top five guy on the draws, and I think that's where his dominance will come. Right, it's not going to come from the speed, maybe not the dangles or the skill, but Barkov can still shoot the puck. He's a great playmaker, so I think it's like that center matchup's going to be really interesting for me.
I mean, two of the best centers in the league, and I mean, obviously, Jordan Settle's been in the discussion where we were saying at the beginning of the season, I don't think he has, he deserves to be in that elite category. That's what we were saying, especially when it came to his goal scoring. But as we were proved wrong throughout the season, time and time again, he just showed how effective he is on that power play. His 5-on-5 stats might not back up and put him in that elite category like we've seen with Austin Matthews, one of the best 5-on-5 players statistically. I mean, the stats have proved it. It's just a proven fact. But like we said, two good centers facing off. It's going to be a good series. And I don't know what you think about this coaching matchup, but looking at what Paul Maurice has provided for the Florida Panthers so far, it's just been crazy, especially for the media too. Like watching his interviews has been hilarious. I saw a little stat saying that in his swear jar, I think Sportsnet did it. He's already at six, so he swore six times in interviews, and it's kind of just taken off the load and the stress about from, maybe the media for the team because it's almost like he puts that stress on himself, right? More media talking about him and,
Mhm.
what he has said in the interviews rather than how their players have played. What do you think about that?
Yeah, you actually said it really perfect about he puts the stress on himself. Where like he's willing to say things that have like a tad of controversy. Where again, the attention goes back to Paul Maurice. It's not like Paul Maurice will say something and then people go out and question his players, right? We've seen it a lot with like I hate to mention Leafs because we said we wouldn't talk about him, but there'd be times where Keefe would like make little gestures about players, or he'd be asked about players specifically, and he'd have to
Yeah.
answer. But like Maurice just like deflects it onto himself, and I think if he's able to do that through the media, he's just going to be, laughing, leaving those interviews, knowing that his players are at ease, call it for the media, right?
I mean, and that's going to be one of the biggest parts that has to be played for this year's Stanley Cup final because it feels like this year more than ever, and it just keeps building and building off this statement. But the media plays such an impact, and even just talking about the Stanley Cup playoffs last year, it's starting to turn into some of the other sports we've seen for many years. I mean, I remember watching basketball almost 8 or 9 years ago, and LeBron James would do like his zero dark 30, I think it was called. He would turn off all social media, all outlets, anything like that would go off. He wouldn't be on his phone, he wouldn't be on social media, especially, talking to the media about their opinions. And looking at the NHL now, it feels like now more than ever, that plays such a factor for not only the mental, but for the physical too, for players too, because you see so many questions. I don't know if you saw today, Truba came out and said that he was playing with a broken ankle, and you can only imagine the amount of times reporters ask and ask, like, "Hey, how's obviously he didn't mention it, but if you remember in the first round, like Sam Bennett broke his hand or whatever might have happened, even with
Mhm.
William Nylander and Matthews going back, it's just like." How many times are you going to ask a player about an injury? How many times are you going to ask a player about a play? How many times are you going
Yeah.
to write about it in your article? And, what kind of toll can that have for a player when it's a 2.5, 2 month journey for them to the Stanley Cup final?
Yeah. And so what was that LeBron thing called again? I liked what you said there.
So I believe he called it zero dark 30. And
Okay.
he would just be off all social media for, I think, like the full 2 months until they lost in the playoffs. And he made this
Yeah.
finals for like 9 years in a row, I think.
Yeah, or I guess Tilly won the finals too, not just lost, right?
Yeah, well, like until they lost, like I mean, they lost twice to Golden State when
Okay.
he was like in Miami. Like all there was a multiple times where he did this 0 dark 30.
Yeah, yeah. See, that I think is huge, but I also think I think that part would be tough when you're looking at reporters and you're looking at real people and like you're in the moment and you want to be an honest, genuine person, but you can't. You almost just need to again deflect the questions, deflect the media a little. You're allowed to answer questions, but like man, you can just imagine how direct these reporters are when they ask you a question. You want to be honest, but like well, at the end of the day, how can you avoid the question of like, do you have a broken ankle? What are you gonna say to that, right? So
It's almost like you just need to deflect it as much as possible. And maybe if you're a player that isn't as good as that, you're not quote unquote as media trained as
yeah.
some of these veteran players, that could be a struggle. But it just goes to show how different the NHL is now compared to 10 years ago, where Twitter and Instagram and TikTok and some of these
Mhm.
media outlets just weren't as big as they are
Yeah.
now.
Yeah, now it's changed a lot, and I think like after the playoffs, we're gonna see a little more of the even more of the behind the scenes, especially with the Oilers. I mean, unless the Oilers win the Stanley Cup, there's gonna be a lot of drama about their future, the future of McDavid and Draisaitl um in their career. Big reason I say that is because Draisaitl's contract will be up at the end of next year, right? And so he has a big choice to make. At the end of the day, everything but a Stanley Cup is a disappointment. I'm sure you agree, right?
I mean, you could say that. I know that, it looks like all the talk leads to Draisaitl re-signing, and how much he signs for. I don't know. I mean, look at Pedersen, how he performed in the playoffs, and obviously they didn't know that before they signed him, but
Yeah.
you almost need to look at that and say, what kind of comparison can we use there, and what are you going to pay Draisaitl? Darnell Nurse obviously making that big contract, and they still got like 6 more years left of
Mm.
that. You got Evan Bouchard that could become one of the highest paid NHL players.
No,
I
defenseman.
believe, or sorry, one of the highest paid NHL defensemen in, I believe, 2 years he's up for contract. So
Yeah.
you're in a tough spot right now if you're the Oilers. And on top of that, you still have Jack Campbell, who's one of the highest paid players that has ever played a game in the AHL. So it's
Yeah.
almost like the Oilers are very, very lucky to make the Stanley Cup final, in my opinion.
Hmm. You see, I know the word luck is hard to use, but the word or I guess what you were saying about the media and Draisaitl, again, 2 weeks ago I would disagree with the statement that all the talks are pointing at him resigning, and now we can actually say that statement like you were saying. Any talk slash media slash rumor should point to him resigning, knowing that the Oilers took a leap this year, right? And
Yeah.
like we're saying this before the finals, but I think anyone will be able to say if the Oilers do win a Stanley Cup this season, then I think you got to be the most happiest hockey player you are in the last 10 years if you're Dry and McDavid, right?
Yeah, I mean, dude, like, how can you not right now? Because I know at the beginning of the season, with everything that was going on, all the media and everything that was, going on within the locker room, coach gets fired, players are turning on each other out of nowhere. You're at in the Stanley Cup final. So we've seen lots of videos from Leon and McDavid hugging each other,
Yeah.
smiling together. And, that doesn't obviously tell the full story about what's going to happen in the future, but it definitely tells um almost like an amends has been made within the locker room compared to November. And that's obviously without a discussion. We know that's going to happen no matter what. But, it goes to show that making the Stanley Cup final will obviously build, that locker room chemistry. And for the Oilers right now, will that change the future down the road, 3, 4 years down the road? They're going to need it to, because if you're going to sign Draisaitl, you need to prove it now.
Yeah. Yeah, you're gonna have to prove it now. And like hypothetically, the Oilers any locker room will look a lot different in a few years, but the Oilers locker room for sure will have to look different. Like there's just absolutely no reason why Evander Kane will be on the team in 3, 4 years. There's no reason why. I mean, we won't talk about some of those high paid defensemen, but again, a guy like Skinner totally might not be there in 3, 4 years. You just don't know other than the guys who would resign if they win a Stanley Cup, right? So the one thing I totally forgot to mention, and I need to say it because I'm curious on your thoughts and if it's actually a true statement or not. But I believe that this Stanley Cup Finals would be like one of the youngest overall like series in a long time for the Stanley Cup, if that makes sense. You know what I'm trying to say?
Like, what do you mean the
When
longest?
you look at the matchup and you look at every single you look at the roster versus roster comparison in terms of age, I think we're looking at a very young like age to player ratio. Does that make sense?
Like,
Like average age.
oh, I guess yeah, you could say, is that like a stat, or are you kind
Yeah, yeah,
of
that's at least that's a guess of a statistic. I'm sure that StatMuse has it or something, but think of the average age of the Oilers players, and then you think of the average age of the Florida Panthers players, and then you compare that to every single Stanley Cup final. I have a hard time like seeing similarities between this year and like other years. And it I don't know, like it just has to do with like the lack of old players missing on each team. If like I don't see like remember the years where like they had like Mark Stahl and Joe Thornton on like the Panthers, like those years.
yeah, I mean, obviously that was, a couple of years ago, but even like this year, looking at the Oilers too, some young players on that team, Ryan McLeod, Dylan Holloway, even on defense too. Isn't Darren A pretty young? Like he's probably
He's
like
yeah, he's got to be
23.
young. Yeah,
And then
yeah.
you look at some of the players that are playing for Florida, like Kyle Okposo. Like I definitely agree with you to say there's like a discrepancy, right? Even like I want to almost before I know we got 4 minutes, but toss out not only our predictions, but also if each team wins, who do you think will pass or who do you think will get the trophy or the Stanley Cup handed off to them first? Because I was listening to that on 32 Thoughts and I actually saw it on FanDuel too. I saw and I kind of have my idea.
I oh my God, that's a crazy question. I'll get to that in like 30 seconds. I do need to say though that Um, going back to this age discrepancy thing, we didn't even mention Philip Broberg, who's like 23 or something. He's been playing this past couple of games again, like Bouchard, and then yeah, with Florida too, like their whole core like is kind of like 29 and under, like which is pretty awesome, right? So
Yeah.
it's pretty interesting seeing. I'm gonna have to look at that statistic. I'll call myself pretty sharp if it is true, but the only team I remember being young like that was the '09 Penguins, who both of us kind of remember that being our first Stanley Cup final we ever watched. So pretty significant in my eyes. But to answer your question about the trophy being passed on, I'm just gonna give one answer per team. I'll hand it off to you after because I know we're running out of time here. But Edmonton Oilers, it's Leon. Leon, no questions asked for me. And then
Really?
Florida Panthers, and I'll let you give your opinion. Florida Panthers for me, I'm going with a dark horse in Matthew Tkachuk.
Okay. I mean, for me, obviously, McDavid starts out with it. I think that you got to give it to Nugent Hopkins. The longest tenured Oiler. I feel like it's almost like you have to, and then it could go to Leon, then maybe to Hyman. I wish I could pick the order, but you see so many times like where players get it passed off and you didn't really expect it. Like I don't know who it was last year. Obviously started with Mark Stone, and then I think it went to like Marchessault or maybe Eichel. Or no, didn't it go to like Shea Theodore?
Martinez.
Yeah, yeah, Martinez, right?
Well, maybe not. He already had a
Right?
cup. He already had a cup.
I could have sworn it was someone random. Either way, that's gonna be my pick for the Oilers. Looking at Florida, I feel like you got to give it to Ekblad. I don't really see anyone else. You can't really give it to Okposo. I heard people say that. I don't think that's what's gonna
No.
happen if they win.
That's a good pick as well. But I think we're totally missing the like Bobrovsky idea too, just because like he is kind of he right now he could win the Conn Smythe if Florida wins, so that's like a tough call for
Yeah,
me. If he wins the
yeah,
Conn Smythe before the cup is handed off, right? You almost might give it to him, but if he doesn't win the Conn Smythe, that changes things too, right? Um,
yeah,
I will kind of really disagree with the Nuge take just because like. I know he's been there, but like let's not act like Nugent Hopkins has like been like a face or like a name of the Oilers franchise. There's a guy you're forgetting about who's technically been an Oiler for longer than Nugent Hopkins, but
Who?
he's played for other teams as well.
Like,
Hasn't played in
who
the
would it
playoffs
be?
yet.
He hasn't played in the playoffs?
No.
Who is it?
He's classic shootout move, backhand toe dragged it back to the forehand. He scored had a 6 goal game probably 10 years ago for the Oilers. You'll get
Who?
him. We got a minute to guess him, but think
Who?
about
Who
it.
is it?
His first name's Sam.
Oh, Sam Gagne. Doesn't Sam Gagne play for like the Cra Oh no, Eberle. I swear to God, I was thinking Gagne, but then I was thinking that I was like, doesn't he play for the Kraken? I was getting it mixed up with Eberle though. Is he still with
He's with
Edmonton? I
Edmonton.
didn't even know
Yeah.
that. I didn't
Anyways,
even know that.
I had to try and stump you there. He's with Edmonton, hasn't played a playoff game, but he played in the regular season a bit with them. Um, I think that'd be a crazy story to hand off to him just because he has been there a long time, right? So it's like
Yeah.
I think it's really possible, but at the end of the day, I can't lie. I don't think Edmonton's winning. I'll wrap it up with that, and I say I'm gonna take Florida. I don't think they're gonna pound them like you were saying, but I think Florida's gonna win this series, and I'll say 6. So yeah,
No, pretty picks. All right.
yeah,
Well, I appreciate everyone for joining. Eric, thanks again for joining in this week's episode. We will be back next week, and I feel like by then we will already have a good idea of who will be winning the Stanley Cup. I believe 3 games will be done by the next time we are recording. So thank you
yeah.
everyone for joining. Enjoy the Stanley Cup Finals, and we'll see you next week.
Cheers.